You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
And this, of course, is London, but broadcasting to you all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet. Now, let me deal right at the start with something that's been causing waves today. There are no donkeys, and alas, Keir Starmer has no parents. But he does have a 7-acre field of prime development land in Surrey, which a land developer calculates is worth, even on today's depressed figures, £10 million. Now, as I said at the beginning, you can be rich and be a socialist. You can be a millionaire and be a Labour leader. But what you can't be is someone who denies that they are a millionaire, when in fact it turns out they are a multi-millionaire. What you can't be is someone who deceitfully conceals the fact that they are in a financial relationship with other millionaires who are funding their campaign to become the leader of the Labour Party. And it is astounding to me that so many people needed persuading of that in the course of the day on social media. And some of those who've been braying like donkeys in defence of Sir Keir Landsman are those that aided and abetted every single smear against their former leader, Jeremy Corbyn. You really couldn't make it up. Neither could you make up what's happening in the United States. You couldn't make up the fact that the President of the United States said we have 15 cases and they're all going to disappear. And now they have hundreds and thousands of cases and almost 100,000 people dead. You can't make up that the Democrats have put up such a candidate as Joe Biden to face calamity Donald in November. A man who doesn't know how to say his name, even with a teleprompter. Doesn't know what state he's in, doesn't know what office he's running for, doesn't know his wife from his sister, but has his wife, or maybe his sister, next to him all the time, doing all the talking. This is a farce. And as I've said to you before, nothing says the decline of the United States empire like Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. We'll be talking to the wonderful Rachel Blevins in just a few minutes on that very subject. Rachel has become extremely popular indeed on this side of the Atlantic, as she already was on her own. We'll be talking about the coronavirus crisis in the United States and around the world, and of course here in Britain, where calamity Boris Johnson is calling for our children to go back to school, having, I think, last Sunday called on us to go back to work. On Monday, he said. No, not Monday, said his deputy, Wednesday. And now that everyone is being forced back to work, they've got to be alert. I'm being as alert as I possibly can to the coronavirus, although it is 1/1000th of a hair's breadth in width. So you've got to be really alert in order to catch it. I know this, that the closer I get to the more people I get, the more chance I've got of becoming infected with coronavirus. That much I didn't need to be a rocket scientist to work out. And when I factor in that Britain's so-called public schools, note to Americans, everything means the opposite in Britain to what the word actually means in the dictionary. A public school is actually a private school for which you pay through the nose to send your children. They're not going back. They're not going back until September. And they're not going back until every child going in has had a coronavirus test. Now, I know that there's such a thing as Stockholm Syndrome. I know that there's such a thing of people tugging their forelocks, bending their knees to their betters. But if your betters are not sending their kids to school until September, why are you lining up to send yours back to school in June? And what about those Labour politicians? David Blunkett, the man who signed the treaty which is going to send Julian Assange to the United States, but not Anne Sacoulas back to Britain to face trial for killing poor Harry Dunn. Lord Adonis, the postman guy, what's his name? Alan Johnson, and somebody called Barry Sherman, but you won't know who he is, though he's been in Parliament for well nigh 40 years. They've all lined up to kick the teachers, to kick the teachers' unions, calling them wreckers, irresponsible, anti-teaching, when all the teachers are saying is what every worker in the land should be saying. And all the teachers' union are saying is what every union in the land should be saying. We will not send our members back to work until you can guarantee us that they will not become sick and possibly die through working in a toxic workplace. After all, that is the law of the land. It is a criminal offence and potentially corporate manslaughter to allow your workers to go to their death instead of to go to their bench or their place in the work. We'll be talking about coronavirus, of course, with MOATS medic, Dr. Ranjeet Brar, whose videos with us continue to break all records, because he's not only a razor-sharp medical brain, he understands the politics behind all of this, including the rush to sacrifice our children but not theirs, to sacrifice our workers but not them. And who can blame them for trying when they are aided and abetted by false consciousness and supine labour and trade union leaders? But I want to spend the next few minutes talking about the events in Venezuela. You see, it seemed comic opera at the time that a gang of mercenaries, including 2 US citizens, both claiming that they worked as security for Donald Trump, were captured by Venezuelan fishermen and women when they attempted to land on the coast of Venezuela. And they confessed that their purpose was to secure the airport so that the kidnapping of the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, could be carried out and he could be safely flown out of the country into the hands of the gringos, into the hands of Donald J. Trump. That seemed ridiculous. It seemed, as I say, like the plot of a bad soap opera. But now we've learned many other things about Venezuela and about Julian Assange. And both of those connect directly to the same intelligence agency, the CIA. We now know that the British government and secret state, whose names are redacted, took part in a discussion in London, in your Foreign Office, paid for by you, to gain illicit access to contracts worth billions of pounds to rebuild Venezuela once we had succeeded in knocking it down and destroying it. Now, I long ago ceased to hope for diplomacy from the diplomats of the British Foreign Office. But such a brazenly criminal, illegal conspiracy taking place in our Foreign Office almost took my breath away. But what did take my breath away was the revelation in Spanish court documents revealed by the wonderful Grey Zone Project and the peerless Max Blumenthal, is that the CIA, through Sheldon Adelson, the casino boss of the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. Bear with me. I know it sounds like I'm making this up. Adelson's Sands Casino were the secret employers of the security company also being paid by the government of Ecuador to guard Julian Assange and the embassy of Ecuador in London. Instead of guarding Assange, instead of guarding the embassy, this CIA front company was garnering every piece of information that they could possibly get, including the feces from the dirty nappies of the son of Julian Assange, and sending it to Mr. Adelson's security team in the Sands Casino, whereafter it was handed to the United States government. Now, the feces is one thing. Much dirtier is that this company secretly recorded every conversation between Julian Assange and his lawyers about the case being brought against him by the United States government. And the recordings illegally obtained were flown every month to the United States of America and into the hands of the government now seeking Julian Assange's extradition. Now, I'm not a QC, I'm not even a lawyer, but I was a legislator for almost 30 years. And this I can say to you without any fear of contradiction. These facts alone would ensure that these extradition proceedings be thrown out of court with contempt, with laughter. There is no judge anywhere in the civilized world who would tolerate for 1 minute a case proceeding when the people bringing the case have already illegally obtained the privileged client-lawyer confidential discussions between the person being pursued and his legal team. And yet, Assange is still languishing in Britain's Guantanamo Bay, and the United States are still seeking his extradition. And the British judge, I say in very large inverted commas, doesn't give a damn about any of this. Which leads me to conclude that if Assange is extradited to face 175 years in an American dungeon for publishing documents, then there is no law in Britain. Then Britain has ceased to be a member of the civilized world. That Britain is no longer a democracy. and that journalism, broadcasting, freedom of speech has been murdered in plain sight. As I am delighted to welcome my first guest of the evening. The first time I saw and heard Rachel Blevins, a young American woman on RT America with whom I work, I knew she was going to be a big star. I just didn't know it would be here in Britain that she'd become an even bigger star than she is in America. She is journalist, broadcaster, and all-round commentator, Rachel Blevins. Rachel, welcome back to the show. Let's start, if we can, with your coronavirus situation. It's a truism, it's long ceased to be debatable, that the United States has handled this the worst in the world, has the worst outcomes in the world. That must be curtains then for Donald Trump's re-election, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, George, for having me back. And it really has been a massive topic that is going to define the 2020 election based on Donald Trump's response. And there has been a lot to be desired there. You know, right now, not only do we have nearly 90,000 deaths and 1.5 million confirmed cases of the coronavirus, but at the same time, we also have more than 36 million Americans who are out of work, which is the largest loss of jobs in U.S. history. And on top of that, nearly half of those Americans who have applied for unemployment insurance either haven't received their benefits yet or have been denied. And on top of that, we also have 20 million Americans who still have not received their initial stimulus check for just $1,200 from the government. So not only do we have a lot of coronavirus cases, and not only do we have a lot of Americans out of work, but we also have a lot of Americans who aren't benefiting at all from the government and anything it says it's trying to do to help relieve that pain.
That sounds like a recipe for serious trouble in your country. Do you feel that?
Absolutely. And I think it's something that we're just now seeing the effects right now, but it's likely going to continue, and it's going to be a massive topic as we get closer and closer to that November election. And, you know, just right now we're having Americans who are, you know, you see a lot of protest on the streets and people going and protesting at their capitals. And a lot of that is because they're frustrated with the government's response, and they don't have the trust in the government to think that they're going to do the best possible thing by initiating lockdowns, and they want some other option there, and they just don't have that trust built up, and it doesn't look like it's something that's going to be repaired anytime soon.
Now, Nancy Pelosi, resplendent in a $450 scarf, addressed the people on behalf of the Workers' Party, the Democratic Party in the United States. Well, they had to put someone up because Joe Biden is missing in action. And even if they found him, nobody would understand what he was saying. That's Trump's only hope, isn't it? That the Democrats have put up someone even more stupid than him.
Yes, just about. And, you know, the last time we talked, we were wondering, how is Joe Biden going to be able to go through all of these campaign rallies and these debates? And arguably, he couldn't have asked for a better outcome than the one right now, where he literally gets to stay inside of his house and to, you know, get on Twitter, have these pre-recorded videos, that sort of thing, where it's all pre-recorded and he doesn't have to do much live. But at the same time, all Biden has to do is just to criticize what Trump has done. All he has to do is sit in his basement and say, oh, I would have been a better president. I would have made sure that we were more prepared, or that there were more initiatives in place in order to take care of the American people. And people can guess as to whether that would be the case. But he certainly is one that is just doing the bare minimum here.
It's quite obvious to me that either he's going to be pulled out before November, or the expectation is that his vice president will have to take over if he is elected, and probably in quite short order, because he can't possibly be long for this political world. In which case, the focus on who is to be the vice president must be quite intense now. Who are the runners and riders?
Absolutely. Well, we've seen a lot of talk about Stacey Abrams out of Georgia, and there seems to be this focus when it comes to the Democrats on making sure that they have a female vice president or a minority candidate to really be able to talk about those sectors of the population that Biden hasn't really appealed with. Now, on top of that, I would argue that, yes, they're going to put a lot of stock on the vice president, but at the same time, when you look at the fact that the Democratic Party chose to put up Biden instead of Bernie Sanders, it really makes you wonder whether they want to win this election at all, or whether they're looking at the next 4 years and realizing that it may be easier to just have Donald Trump take it for 4 more years and sit back and criticize him until they have a candidate who's maybe along the lines of Biden when it comes to the principles, but better spoken and can carry out an actual speech.
I saw a very controversial tweet from Donald Trump Jr., which focused on the absolutely creepy behavior of Joe Biden around small children, after which I can certainly say I wouldn't let him anywhere near my children, which is quite a thing to have to say about the putative president of the biggest and most powerful country in the world. Is this likely to damage him in conjunction with the really now quite well-known rape charge which is in the air against him?
Yeah, well, you know, before Biden even decided that he was running, I honestly said I would be surprised if he ran based on all of those videos and pictures that are out there of his actions when he's simply around young girls and young women. It is absolutely creepy just to see that he would be okay doing that in public, let alone in private. Now, this is one of those things where, unfortunately, here in the United States, things are so politicized that if someone says, if they accuse Biden of rape or of sexual assault, a lot of times people who are already in favor of him or people who consider themselves Democrats will say, well, what are the actual allegations there? Does this woman remember what happened? And they'll try to pick apart that story, whereas people who are against him will say, oh, yes, I absolutely believe her. And it seems that that is the climate where we're in U.S. politics, where it's almost as if you can only criticize the person and believe those charges against them or believe even the photographic evidence as long as it's not your guy in your party.
Well, I'm reminded of the scene in which Groucho Marx is caught by his wife in bed with his secretary. And he sits up straight and says, it never happened. And then he says, who are you going to believe, me or the evidence of your own eyes? And of course, we've all seen, we can all see dozens, scores of instances of frankly disqualifying behavior in the presence of young children carried out by Joe Biden. What happened to all these pussy hats and liberals and Me Too types and Believe Women types? All those who said that if a woman makes allegations, they have to be treated as if they were true. Aren't they all now backing Joe Biden?
You know, there seem to be a number of people who are backing Joe Biden just because he's not Donald Trump. And that's something that we saw a lot of back in 2016, where it was the people who said, well, I don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton, so I'll vote for Trump, or the people who said, I can't stand Trump, I don't want him to be president, so I'll vote for Hillary Clinton. But one of the things that we saw in 2016 was we saw the lowest voter turnout in 20 years here in the United States because we had two of the most unpopular candidates of all time. And now what they've done is we still have Trump on the one side, but they've simply replaced Hillary Clinton with Joe Biden. And so I think there should be a lot of outrage in the Democratic Party for all of these people who say, wait a minute, this is supposed to be the party for women, for minorities, for all of these people who don't feel like they're represented by the Republicans. Why aren't we getting that representation? And of all people, why is Joe Biden our nominee?
Now, finally, and I'm grateful for your time as always, Rachel, the Democrats really, really hate Russia. And the Republicans really, really hate China. Is that the kind of election we're going to get? The Democrats claiming that Trump is a Russian agent and Trump claiming that Biden is a Chinese agent?
That definitely could be the outcome. You know, as far as the Democrats go, we're seeing new evidence come out about the case of Michael Flynn Trump's former national security advisor and everything that happened there. But I also think it's important to remember that the mainstream media here in the United States, CNN, Fox News, they were the ones that peddled the Russiagate theory for years with no evidence whatsoever. And the intelligence community didn't come in and try to dissuade them from doing that at all. And so we have to remember that when it comes to the intelligence community and when it comes to their leanings here, if they can get the American people to believe that any government from any other country was able to successfully influence an election, then they know that they have that card in their hand, and it's one that they can pull out at any time whatsoever in the elections to come. So they're not saying anything about, okay, is it possible that Russia could influence our election, even when we don't have evidence of that. And at the same time, when it comes to China, President Trump has to be careful where he's going with that, because he's sitting there and he's throwing out tariffs here or more of a trade war there, and that is going to have a massive impact on the American people at a time when he could be pushing for getting information from China as to how to deal with the coronavirus, which is the biggest thing that we are all dealing with right now.
Rachel Blevins from RT America, thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Very good to see you again. Is it safe to let children return to school? A, yes, 36%. No, 64%. You can vote now on my Twitter feed, at George Galloway. 852 of you have voted this far. Let me read some of the comments that are coming in. Adam says, schools are still open anyway. The school I work for is open to essential workers' children. Schools should open for people who now need to get back to work, but there should be no sanction if people prefer not to send their kids in. In my case, Adam, I'll send my children back to school when Eton, Harrow and the rest go back. Stuart says, when the MPs are back in the House of Commons, perhaps I will think about sending my kids to school, but there should be no sanction. Until then, I'd rather have them safe at home with me. And Ian says, I voted no, but not because of COVID, but because what they teach our kids these days is garbage, and some of it is borderline child abuse. And June says, the children will be fine. It's the teachers who will be taken poorly, having to deal with children who are infected. That's the issue. And Luke says they shouldn't be going back to school until the lockdown has completely ended. We can't even manage adults to adhere to social distancing. And Tracy said, whoever said, yes, I want your evidence that shows it's safe. You either don't have children or you are brainwashed fools. And a Twitter user says there's little evidence of transmission from kids. Why would that be? Why are kids able to pass on everything else but not the coronavirus? That doesn't even make sense. It's not like flu where they are super spreaders. Unless there are vulnerable adults in the same household, it's safe. Keep drinking the Kool-Aid, brother. And on Twitter, Wildcat75 says, children, because they cannot vote and do not pay taxes, are the single most important yet powerless demographic in the modern industrialized world. There's not a more oppressed demographic, as far as I understand the world to be. Well, I became a donor this week to something called WaterAid when I saw their ad, which told me that 800 children every single day, die from drinking dirty water. Just think about that. As I said earlier, it's been a pretty bad week for the US intelligence community. First of all, the fabricated case against General Michael Flynn has fallen apart, and the US Justice Department has walked away from their previous prosecution of him in connection with the Russiagate affair. I feel a personal link to this because just couple of months before he was arrested, I was sitting at the same dinner table as him in Moscow, where he was an invited and paid speaker at the RT anniversary celebrations. The Russiagate mania then claimed that he was somehow in Moscow as part of Donald Trump's Russian entanglements, and that somehow he was betraying his country. Nothing could be more absurdly far from the truth. And so, although I share nothing in common with General Michael Flynn, nothing at all, I know because I've had a long talk with him, I think that he was grievously the victim of an injustice. And so I'm very glad that the deep state persecution of Flynn has now fallen apart. And then there was the revelation in the grey zone, I think just about the most significant of the new media outlets that are plying their trade today. And if you're not following them, you really, really must. The grey zone revealed, Max Blumenthal revealed, their star writer, that the CIA were actually employing the people that the Ecuador government thought they were employing to guard their embassy, and their most famous inhabitant in any embassy, anywhere ever in the world, namely Julian Assange. But in fact, this company, a Spanish company of private investigators, security company, were working for the CIA. And not just that, but working for a man called Sheldon Adelson. He was the cutout. He's a larger-than-life casino owner in Las Vegas. I'm not making this up. He's also, of course, Israel's #1 man in America. He is the font of undreamt of sums of money given to people who are supportive of Israel, and he's also the man who spends the money to take down people that are not sufficiently supportive of Israel. So the CIA took another hit. But the biggest hit is surely the Bay of Piglets attempt to invade Venezuela from the sea with a gang of idiots that were captured by the fishermen and women off the coast of Venezuela. Now, our next guest links, in a way, all of these stories because he is a journalist and contributor to the Grey Zone, The Canary, and, of course, our own Sputnik. And he's the editor of theinterregnum.net. And he's here, I hope, to speak to me now. Mohamed Elmaazi, welcome very much to the mother of all talk shows. Let's start with the Venezuela fiasco. Just bring the listeners and viewers who are not perhaps as up to date as you on this story with what happened.
Thank you very much for having me, George, on your show. So briefly, it's all very dogs of war for anybody who's aware of the reference. Essentially a private mercenary force apparently enlisted for the sum of $213 million, according to a contract, or $212.9 million, to capture, detain, or remove Nicolas Maduro, as well as to secure certain areas in the country on behalf of self-appointed interim president and opposition figure Juan Guaido, who's backed by the United States government and is also recognized by governments such as that of Britain. This mercenary force, which had a few former U.S. Special Forces members, Green Berets, that's a branch of the U.S. Army, so U.S. Army Special Forces, along with at least 60 military, police, National Guard defectors from the Venezuelan state over the years, were all part of this mission. At least 8 were killed. I think it looks like far more now are known to have been killed. Others captured. Goudreau, apparently, so Jordan Goudreau, who's the CEO of Silver Corp, this unit, or who's still in the United States, so he's safe. He's not captured in Venezuela. He himself has come out, said that this was, that he was part of this. He hasn't denied it. We've seen passports of the Green Berets, as well as their ID cards belonging to Silver Corp that they apparently took with them to Venezuela. And yeah, this is all in the context of incredibly crushing U.S. sanctions on the country of Venezuela that have been going on for years now. They began under Obama, but escalated much further under the administration of Donald Trump, with the explicit goal of effecting regime change, and which have resulted in, according to one estimate from the Center of one report from the Center of Economic and Policy Research, a Washington, D.C. based think tank, has resulted in at least 40,000 excess deaths in Venezuela in 1 year alone, 2017 to 2018. When people say, on the one hand, yes, it seems like a complete fiasco, which doesn't make them look good at all, doesn't make the United States government look good. On the other hand, this is within the wider context of continued attempts for regime change and the overthrow of the government, the democratically elected government, which a whole host of international observers have said, are free and fair, for an electoral system which Jimmy Carter himself has said, described as being a model. Forbes magazine did an investigation in 2013 and called Venezuela's electoral system a model for the world, notwithstanding statements that people have made since then. And yet, from 2002, as you may recall, when Hugo Chavez was president, to today, there have been countless now attempts to overthrow the government that have been overtly and covertly backed by the United States government.
And yet
this appears to be the latest.
The United States is a country that claims that Russia interfered in its election in 2016 and has adopted law after law to preclude anyone seeking from abroad to be interfering in their politics. Yet this same country is expending hundreds of millions of dollars to employ hired killers to change the regime in someone else's country.
Yeah, it would appear so. I mean, they're claiming deniability. I don't know how plausible it is, because this contract that we've seen, which the Washington Post has now published on its site, there's two separate contracts. One which actually, in part of it, explicitly states that the mercenary force has authority under the contract to use deadly force in quote-unquote high collateral damage areas to when they're targeting certain figures. But so the contract appears to be with Juan Guaido, who is the person who's backed by Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump, Elliot Abrams, and others. And we were hearing things only a few days before this foiled plot from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who said that actually the momentum is building and there are plans underway to reopen the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. Also, there were tweets, not so cryptic tweets, from regime change hawk John Bolton, who was until recently a member of the Trump administration, that seemed to suggest something was happening. And it's worth noting, and I'm sure that we'll discuss this in a moment, that this contract was signed in the autumn of last year, October 2019, which is the same time period that the British Foreign Office apparently opened up a secret unit around the same time, which it started to liaise with the Venezuelan opposition, specifically members of the Venezuelan opposition who were linked to violent attempts to overthrow the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro.
Yes, I will come back to that. But first, if the United States itself as a state was not involved in this invasion and incursion into Venezuela, why have the Trump administration said that if these two Green Berets are not released, that the United States will come and get them, will come and rescue them, even though, by any standards, they are guilty of a serious crime?
That's exactly right. And as I said, whatever levels of denials that we've heard, given the fact that we were getting messaging from key government figures like Mike Pompeo that something was coming up. So I think it was the 29th of April, Mike Pompeo had made statements that I mentioned only moments ago, that we should expect something is coming and that the U.S. Embassy will be reopening Venezuela. It sort of lends itself to the idea that the U.S. government, the U.S. states, even if they weren't directing it from the start, were at least aware of it. and were supportive of it. And I should say that according to the best friend of Jordan Goudreau, a former Special Forces man himself, who's not part of this operation as far as we know, he told Anya Parampil of the Grey Zone on her show when she spoke to him via phone, and I recommend that people listen to that program, Red Lines on the Grey Zone, where he had said that Goudreau had told him that there was a contact of the U.S. State Department that was aware of and supported the contract. So even if the United States was using a sort of a cutout, if you like, nonetheless, there is quite a lot of evidence, I think, even if it's circumstantial.
Quite a lot of evidence in this case, but if you look at the book, the United States has done this in practically every continent for 75 years at least. So there's no reason to disbelieve the theory that the United States was up to its neck in this attempt. What is more surprising, at least to some of our viewers and listeners, will be that the British government was involved in a secret plan with violent oppositionists seeking the violent overthrow of a recognized government, not by Britain, but recognized by the United Nations and therefore covered by international law, to get contracts for British companies to rebuild Venezuela before they've even destroyed it fully.
That's right. That's actually a brilliant expose by a colleague of mine from the Canary, John McAvoy, and I interviewed him for Sputnik on his very piece, which is the product of government documents that he obtained through a series of Freedom of Information requests. And in those documents, he discovered the existence of a previously unknown unit in the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, called the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit. And as he points out, before you can have reconstruction, you have to have deconstruction, or at least destruction. And that is, interestingly enough, the creation of this unit seems to come about at the exact same time that this contract is signed between Juan Guaido, the right-wing opposition figure, and Silver Corp, the U.S.-based mercenary security force behind this failed coup or incursion. So if you look at some of the documents are redacted, but according to the information that we do know that he uncovered, John McAvoy uncovered, former UK ambassador to Venezuela and a longtime ambassador elsewhere was one of the key figures, or is one of the key figures in this Venezuela reconstruction unit. And as you say, they have been liaising covertly and secretly with members of the right-wing opposition who are linked to calls for violent overthrow of their government, including links to, support for the United States in doing so, which I think here and in the United States, that would be known as treason, just flat out, right, without mincing words. That this unit has mention of business interests that British businesses would have access to, without going into specifics. But some of your viewers may be aware that Venezuela sits upon the largest known oil reserves on the planet, although much of it is hard to get at. It's not the highest quality oil. It is nonetheless incredibly large in terms of its reserves. Venezuela is one of the, if not the single largest supplier of oil to the United States, and that didn't stop under the current government.
Mohamed Elmaazi, thank you very much indeed for bringing us up to speed on the dirty business with Venezuela. Thanks very much indeed for that. Is it safe to let children return to school? 1,321 of you have voted. Yes, 31. No, 69. You've got until 9 o'clock to get your vote in on that. Let me take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik.
We call Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan the most disruptive radio show in America.
It's a great show and we have a lot of fun.
We come to you live from Washington, D.C. every Monday through Friday morning.
What I like best is that we bring in experts from all over the world. From Barcelona, from Egypt, from Seoul, South Korea.
From Newark, New Jersey. We try to bring people great guests, great calls from our listeners, and, of course, stupid jokes. And we do it with two hosts that have very different viewpoints. Now, here's the thing, Garland. A lot of people would think you and I would just argue. I mean, I'm a Republican Trump supporter.
And, of course, I am a progressive Democrat Bernie Sanders supporter.
The surprising thing is how much we actually agree on.
And you won't be surprised because you're going to find out just how much you agree and just how much you enjoy this show.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Now get your calls in. The British number, UK number, is 02077 982 255, and the US number is 001 757 744 4480. Or you can tweet us at George Galloway at RTUK News. Now, this is the spot where I look back at the 7 days in history which shaped or distorted our world, starting with a truly bizarre one. It was on this day in 1978 that Charlie Chaplin's stolen body was found. His body and coffin had been missing from the grave, which was robbed 11 days before. It was dug up from a field about a mile away from the Chaplin home in Switzerland. Roman Wardas, a 24-year-old Pole, and Granchko Ganev, a 38-year-old Bulgarian, were convicted in December 1978 of stealing the coffin and trying to extort £400,000 from Charlie Chaplin's family. Wardas was sentenced to 4.5 years hard labour for masterminding the plot to ransom Chaplin's body. Earlier in 1960, the much-anticipated Big Four summit in Paris failed before it even began. The issue was the US U-2 spy plane, which had been shot down by Russia over the country 2 weeks before, initially denied by the Americans. The American pilot, Gary Powers, who bailed out, was sentenced to 10 years in a Soviet prison in August 1960, but was exchanged for a Soviet spy in 1962. There were no further U-2 flights over the USSR, as after the 1961 spy incident, satellites performed the same function. Spinning back several centuries, it was in 1291, on May the 18th, that after 100 years of Crusader control, Acre became the last Christian stronghold reconquered in Palestine. I'll be speaking about Palestine on Tuesday night, by the way, at 8 p.m. online on all platforms, if you're interested in my take on that. More than 5 centuries later, on the same day, that's May the 18th, in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was proclaimed himself, Emperor of France by the French Senate, which was a rubber stamp assembly. In 1944, after 6 days of fighting, Polish troops finally entered the ruins of the ancient hill monastery of Monte Cassino, which had been a symbol of German resistance since the beginning of the year. Both of my grandfathers fought in that battle of Monte Cassino under Montgomery in the 8th Army as part of the Highland Division. And both told me how horrific a battle Monte Cassino actually was. On the same day, still the 18th of May, in 1972, the Nazi sympathiser, the Duke of Windsor, was not well enough to attend tea with Britain's Queen Elizabeth, her uncle, when she came to visit his home in Paris. The Queen, with Prince Philip and Prince Charles, was due to see him for the first time in 5 years, and the first time in his own home. 10 days later, the Duke died. He had been suffering from throat cancer for some time. On the 19th of May in 1536, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was beheaded at the Tower of London on charges of adultery, incest and treason. And in 1974, the Gaullist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was elected President of France, defeating the socialist François Mitterrand. His main contribution was the formation of the European Council in 1974, a group of all heads of state of member countries that pushed forward a European monetary system in 1979. I wonder how that one's going. On the 20th of May in 1927, another Nazi sympathizer, Charles Lindbergh, took off from New York to cross the Atlantic for Paris aboard the Spirit of St. Louis on the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic. A day later, Lindbergh arrived. It was on that same day in 1932 that Amelia Earhart landed in Derry in the north of Ireland after flying for 17 hours from Newfoundland. It was the first solo transatlantic flight by a woman. In 1991, on that day, Rajiv Gandhi, the former Indian Prime Minister, was assassinated while campaigning for the Congress Party when a powerful bomb hidden in a basket of flowers exploded, killing him instantly. It later emerged that a female Tamil Tiger suicide bomber had killed him. In 1987, Gandhi, then Prime Minister, had sent Indian peacekeeping forces to Sri Lanka. On May 22nd in 1981, the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper, the mass murderer Peter Sutcliffe, was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Old Bailey. He had been convicted of murdering 13 women. Sutcliffe was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent from Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight to Broadmoor Secure Mental Hospital in Berkshire in 1983, where I think he still is. On May the 23rd in 1813, South American independence leader Simón Bolívar entered Mérida, leading the invasion of Venezuela, and was proclaimed El Liberador, the liberator. In 1988, on the same day, the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace of sorts to the north of Ireland, was ratified on both sides of the border in a referendum. That was a truly tumultuous 7 days. That was the week. That was. Let's go back to the phone lines and talk to Brent in Southampton on schools. Go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, hello there, George. Just on the subject of schools, I'm a supply teacher, and I suppose I have a vested interest in schools reopening. But I guess also I have a vested interest in staying alive myself. You know, the British Medical Association have advised schools remain shut, the teaching unions. What I want to talk about in particular is Ian Austin has attacked the teaching unions for trying to represent their members and who perhaps don't want to catch the virus and, you know, die. I just want to know what you think about how someone like Ian Austin ever became a Labour MP, or, to that matter, someone like him was ever allowed to even join the Labour Party.
He's a wretched individual and always has been, but he wasn't just an MP. He was once a heartbeat away from Gordon Brown, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, later Prime Minister. Ian Austin was as close as it's possible to be, decently, to the top Labour leadership. He then spent the whole of the tenure of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader attempting politically to assassinate him. He lent himself to every smear, every slander. And then in the days before the last general election, he literally joined the Tories. He accepted a position from the Tory government. He paraded around the streets in front of the cameras as a former Labour MP. He was still an MP at that time. It was immediately prior to the last election, calling on people to vote for Boris Johnson. And now he's attacking the school teachers. But a wretch like him can be written off because he's part of Labour's past. But Alan Johnson isn't. Barry Sherman isn't. He's still a Labour MP. Lord Adonis, only a year ago, was at the top of the list of Euro fanatics standing for Labour in the European Parliament elections that should never have taken place, as we had already voted to leave. So these people, and David Blunkett, he's still in the Labour Party. He's described in the papers as a Labour grandee. And of course, none of these people have been contradicted by any Labour frontbench spokesperson, and certainly not by the Labour leader, Sir Keir Landsman. Now, I mean, that's the bigger scandal, Brent.
Well, what I think is a bigger scandal is why Jeremy Corbyn did absolutely nothing about people like Ian Austin and some of the others that you mentioned. He was he never stood up for Ken Livingstone, for Chris Williamson and people like that, whilst he allowed people like Margaret Hodge and those sort of people to pretty much gave her free rein.
Yes, well, I'm afraid there's no contradicting that, painful though it is to acknowledge it. That's the reality. Not only did he not do anything against these people, he promoted some of them. He could have said, Lord Adonis, who has told Brexit voters that they should not vote Labour, is not fit to be a Labour candidate. And I'm withdrawing the Labour name from his candidature. He could have done that. He promoted Starmer and several others who had been prominent backstabbers and coup makers against him. Now, any history of this period will show that he therefore was a willing accomplice in his own downfall. And look where that leaves the working class in this country. Last word to you,
Brent.
I mean,
I agree. I mean, it would have been great to have had in this country a left-wing social democratic party, championing the interests of working people. Sadly, that was not to be. I joined the Labour Party actually around about 2015, and all I seemed to notice people doing was ways of stopping Brexit, ways of staying in an organisation that would have actually prevented a large part of Corbyn's programme from happening. I mean, that's the state the Labour Party's in.
Bravo.
Bravo.
That's
why I've now left
Bravo.
it, incidentally.
And the author of that plan was Sir Keir Starmer. And his most able lieutenant was John McDonnell, who is shortly to be lecturing the left on what they need to do in the future. You couldn't make it up, Brent. Thanks very much for an excellent call. Is it safe to let children return to schools? A, yes, 30%. B, no, 70%. And you can vote now, still, until 9 o'clock on my Twitter feed. Now, let me read some more of the comments that are coming in. Jack says, no, the schools should not go back. The R rate is not low enough. The death rate's far too high. We don't know enough about nascent problems such as the Kawasaki disease and the almost totally ignored post-viral issues, long-term health conditions, which are being reported by recovered COVID-19 patients. And Lee says, any child that doesn't obey the rules should be sent home and maybe do it as a 3-day week, so you get half the class sizes. But I wouldn't if I had kids. Well, by the grace of God, I've got lots of kids, and I will not allow them to go back to school until Eton and Harrow have gone back, until it's safe for the children of our rulers to go back. That's not rocket science, really. And by the way, Lee, children in schools cannot be asked credibly to obey social distancing rules. I got a report very recently of children who had gone back, and you know that a lot of children of essential workers have still been going to school, and brave teachers have still been trying to teach them. But the children are all hugging each other and playing in the playground because that's what children do. Children require adults to stop them getting into situations where they will be harmed. Let's talk to John in Pickering. Go ahead, John.
Hey, George. Thank you for having me on.
Welcome, sir.
Yeah. Well, it's the exact point I want to talk to you about, the R rate. I'm in the north of England, and Rydale, which is my constituency, is probably what you'd consider to be quite an affluent area. However, 20 miles north, Middlesbrough isn't. Now, when you talk about compliance rates, when we were in lockdown, Rydale has a 90% compliance rate. Everyone stayed in. We're all good boys and girls. Middlesbrough had a 20% compliance rate. So we get to the R number. In London, it's gone down dramatically. Everyone seems to be doing pretty well. They've got the infection rate down. Boris now wants everyone to go back to work and start the economy again. But in Middlesbrough and Hartlepool, the mayor of Hartlepool came out just yesterday and said, nobody should be going back to work. Our R rate is climbing. It's dangerous. So does anybody really care about the north of England or the northeast, the northern powerhouse, or as Dennis Skinner would say, the poor house? Because that's how it feels like. It's true. People in the northeast, oh, it's all right, yeah. The reason we have a 20% compliance rate there is because the people in the northeast have lived in dangerous conditions for God knows how long. They don't really care. They're not that frightened. They live in small houses, a lot of them, and they live in poor conditions. And they live in, well, not real poverty, but they live in certainly more poverty than where I live, in Rydale. So there's hardly any wonder they've got a slightly low, dramatically low compliance rate, and now we've got a high R rate. So what do you think about that, George? Am I right?
I think, first of all, that's the call of the night so far, brilliantly, succinctly summed up in every regard. What I do know is that the closer I get to people who are not in my household, the more likely I am to catch the coronavirus. The larger the number of people with whom I get close, the more likely I am to catch the coronavirus. And so, for me, and I'm not Einstein, it's a no-brainer, really. It's my job to protect myself, but more importantly, to protect my small children that depend on me by staying away from people as much as I possibly can and staying away from large groups of people as much as I possibly can. Now, the R rate is, of course, the bull point. If you are infecting at least one other person, then the numbers are still climbing. If you are infecting fewer than one person, then obviously things begin to reduce. Now, as this farce of an end to the lockdown has unfolded, with people milling around close to each other on public transport with no protection, not even for the staff that are operating the public transport. And going into works, I see the car industry is starting tomorrow in the West Midlands, 2,000 people going back to work in a factory. Well, again, you don't need to be Einstein to surmise that the R rate is going to rapidly increase. And then the pressure on the National Health Service, which we were told the lockdown had been introduced to obviate, will dramatically be enhanced instead. And lastly, John, any fool knoweth, or ought to, that the second wave of the Spanish flu pandemic in the immediate post-World War I era killed far more people than the first wave had done. Even the third wave of it killed more people than the first wave had done. So for me, this is really not difficult. It's not difficult to work out, John. I'm surprised that there's anybody out there who hasn't worked it out. Last word to you.
It's frightening. Well, I totally agree with you, but you see, in the northeast, this isn't the second wave. It's actually the first wave, because we were 3 weeks behind the infection rate that London had. So this is something that was always going to be catching up. And therefore, we're all going to be sent back to work when our rate's climbing. What's going to happen? I'll tell you what, I don't think it'll end well for the northeast. And when our infection rate does go high and people are dying and our hospitals are full, you think the government will just turn around and say, oh no, we've got a slight problem in the northeast in these industrialised areas where people are working 2 feet from one another. Do you think they'll shut it down? No, they won't, because it'll cost too much bloody money. That's why. So, yeah, I do worry for the safety of these people that are going to be forced back to work.
And yet, John, there's still 30% on my poll, on my show, think it's safe to let children return to school, when children are well known to be spreaders of all kinds of germs and bugs, because they're running around at the closest possible quarters amongst 20, 30, 50, 70 other kids all day, and then they come home.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a recipe for disaster, there's no doubt.
It is.
But
John, thanks.
That Middlesbrough do have in their favour. They've got a wonderful hospital, James Cook, which I'm thankful for. My son was born just about 4 months ago, and he was born about 10 weeks premature, and they were superb. And I can't thank them enough for what they've done for my family. So
God protect them. God protect them and bless your child. John, thank you very much indeed. That poll is closed now. 1,658 people voted. A, yes, 31%. B, no, 69%. So more than 2 to 1 say it is not safe to let children return to school. But almost a third did think it was safe to let children back to school. Well, you can include me out in that. Now, Dr. Ranjeet Brar has been with us right throughout this crisis. His fame has rightly grown because of the super sharp analysis that he's provided listeners and viewers to the mother of all talk shows over what now seems like months. I can hardly imagine life without Dr. Ranjeet, and he joins me now, I hope. Yes, indeed. Dr. Ranjeet, can you deal first with a question that was raised earlier? Colonel Tom Moore, in his epic Walking Feat, raised £31 million for what was at first described as NHS charities, although that began to change a little, I noticed, and the formulation began to be for the NHS. And there have no doubt been other charitable activities and donations. And people are asking, where has this money gone? Now, I know you don't run the health service, I wish you did, but do you have any idea how I should answer them?
George, thanks very much for having me back. Pleasure to be with you. And I think it's a very interesting and crucial point. The NHS, everyone feels it currently to be cash-strapped and under-resourced, and that's particularly evident on the front line, where for many years we've seen clinics cut, services cut, waiting lists introduced by stealth, really because of undercapacity, beds cut, peripheral estates being sold off, hospitals being redeveloped under PFI. So there's always a feeling that there's under-resourcing, but the actual budget, the amount the state puts into the NHS, is large. It's over 120, towards 130 billion pounds a year. So that clearly would dwarf any amount that is being raised in charitable efforts, and it's laudable to see the efforts of whether it's Captain Tom or anyone else who wants to raise money for the NHS. They do so often for specific appeals. Sometimes hospitals will have local scanner appeals or appeals for the vascular service who want to get certain research funded. So there's all kinds of charity associated with medicine. All of it shows the love that people have for the NHS, as does the clapping for the NHS and all of those initiatives. But what we have to be very careful of is that the wool is not being pulled over our eyes, because really the main challenge and the main drain on the NHS's resources is not of even this order of magnitude of a few million here and there, but there are billions which are being directly passed through the NHS to massive private conglomerate companies, both of capital in redeveloping the NHS, particularly with PFI. And we've talked about that before, but where 12 billion was lent to the NHS, but the NHS will have to repay over 92 billion. And that is being repaid from the actual current account of hospitals who are currently having to rent their premises. And at the end of their 40 or 60-year mortgages, they will not own those premises. They will still remain the property of those private companies. So there's a huge amount of, frankly, robbery that goes on in the NHS. I can't tell you, George, exactly where the 20 or 30 million that Captain Tom will raise will end up. And certainly we should ask to know. But what's clear is it's not going to fill a hole the size of the very real schemes which we're told were given to introduce market efficiency, to make the NHS more efficient, more responsive, to make our money go further. But really, that's not the way private capital operates. If private capital invests, it expects a return. If private capital invests in a public service, the NHS, prisons, schools, and it's happening throughout libraries, happening throughout our public services, they expect a return. And that return comes from the budget of government. So, it's a false economy. And in fact, it really amounts to a huge robbery. And probably the only rational demand to right that wrong is to simply say we demand that our government cancels those PFI contracts. Exactly where the money from Captain Tom and other fundraising goes, you can find from a Freedom of Information request, and perhaps that we can organise that. I do not know at this stage where that money is. A lot of it would be with his website that raised it, and no doubt he's looking for the right person to pass it on to, and we should ask. But it's never going to be of the order of magnitude of the massive schemes of privatisation, which are the real assault upon the NHS and other public services.
It's worth making the point, in terms of balance, that the greatest spike in these so-called PFI deals, public-private partnerships, came not under Boris Johnson or Theresa May or David Cameron, but came under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the so-called Labour prime ministers.
It's absolutely right. It's not a point that anyone who supports the Labour Party ever wants to hear, and I'm afraid that's been a point which has scuppered the movement to defend the NHS, precisely because, unfortunately, many people who engage in these activities are very partisan, and they wish to push a point in favour of Labour or in favour of the Tory party. And that was the case with the junior doctors' strike, when really it should have been about defending the NHS, defending public services, defending the pay and conditions of those who work within them. Many people who got involved with that strike were more in favour of just promoting the interests of a Labour Party government as the solution to all problems, which I'm afraid that government quite clearly shows it wasn't. You're right. I used to think that they initiated PFI. In fact, probably the first contracts were put forward by John Major, but they were hugely unpopular and they were pretty much mothballed. And it was Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and their Health Minister Frank Dobson, and later Alan Milburn, who were the absolute champions of PFI. And they pumped, billions of dollars or billions of pounds of private capital because they could get these hospitals then rebuilt, apparently off the budget sheet. So avoiding the accusation that Labour was the party of spending. But the deals were so angled that they were kind of irresistible to private capital because they didn't carry any risk. They could actually develop them off their balance sheet, so they weren't liable to taxes. They got tens of millions of pounds in tax relief while they were building these hospitals, and they are still recouping the benefit, and they expect to do so for many years to come. It's 12 or 13, perhaps 15 billion soon a year, which is being paid to these private consortia from the state budget, not just for NHS, but for many different companies, and it'll be 350 or 400 billion in total that the state is liable for when they got perhaps 70 billion overall. And it's not just the NHS, it's schools, hospitals, prisons, it's many different streams of funding.
And of course, the money that's being spent on paying these interest charges, paying the rent, as it were, is money that cannot then be spent on nurses and doctors and ventilators and all the things that we need in the NHS. Let me move on, though, if I may, Doctor. Roche has come up with, they say, 100% successful antibodies test, which can test whether or not you have had the coronavirus. When are we likely to see that? And doesn't the fabulous profit that will be made from this welcome development, and the even more fabulous profit that will be made if and when a vaccine for the coronavirus is found, buttress the call that you and I both have made separately and together, that the pharmaceutical industry should have been a part of the health service right from the very beginning?
That's absolutely right, George. So, I mean, always happy when there are advances in medicine that might benefit the population. Always happy. But of course, you know, no one in this day and age should be dying of malnutrition and simple infections related to malnutrition. But we know 14 million children a year do die. So unfortunately, under the current system, when medicines are available, when technology is available, they don't reach and treat the global population precisely because so much of the global population is impoverished. And yes, the drugs burden, even for a developed country like Britain in the National Health Service, is very considerable, 20 or 25 billion a year. And yes, Roche, I'm very happy they've developed a test. It's dangerous to say 100% sensitive, 100% specific. Every test has a certain degree of specificity and sensitivity. And those things may be very, very high, and I'm sure the test is good. But it's not the first person to develop an antibody test. Those were developed very rapidly in Korea. They were developed in China, and they've been developed elsewhere. We at one stage said we had 3.5 million, but they were given back because they didn't work. But details about that were not published, and I still don't know actually where those 3.5 million tests were secured from and then returned. So the point is really to control as far as we do need mass testing. So I'm happy if that can be put into effect. But yes, why is it that we don't have a national laboratory, a national medical development company, a national development sector that is unable to provide these and roll them out for the benefit of the population? And then that huge debt burden would become a source of income for the general population rather than a source of our indebtedness.
Well, especially as the universities are paid for by us and by our students who go there, but the state is responsible for our university sector, which is where all these clinicians and scientists, researchers are being trained. I mean, if we had this in our own hands, it wouldn't just be saving a huge sum of money for the NHS, it would be a better guarantor that we weren't then putting junk into people just for the sake of making a profit from it, or because we'd already invested so much in producing it, we had to use it.
Well, I think there's a lot in that, George. Essentially, why should it be the case that only certain avenues are funded? I mean, so not all scientists are employed in the university sector. Many are, all were trained there. Many are employed by private companies. But the interest of private companies, there's a conflict. Yes, they need a useful product. It has to serve some purpose. But what they'd really like is a particular kind of medicine that needs to be taken in perpetuity. And there is an example of a colleague, professor of mine, who invented a drug for acidity in the stomach, essentially the precursor of omeprazole. And he was phoned up by essentially a Wall Street broker who heard that he was going to develop this medicine and wanted to know whether you could take a one-off dose and that would cure the problem, or whether you'd have to take it in perpetuity. And when he said, well, you'd have to keep on taking it, he said, thank you very much. And that then became the source of a huge money-spinning drug because you can keep on selling it. And in the United States, there are many people who are in their 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They can't retire because the cost of their medicines is so prohibitive. They have to keep on working just to, keep themselves in pills to preserve their health, which is a terrible situation to be in. So the kind of medicines which are invested in are those which are going to make the most profit. Medicines which can be used, which are cheap and effective and don't make profit, are unfavored. And equally, preventative medicine and it links up very much with food, housing, all kinds of conditions which can make for a healthy lifestyle are neglected. So the entire way in which we approach health and sustainable living is the priorities are very much wrong when private profit and private investment are the driver and motivator for production, George.
And sanitation, Doctor, finally. My children actually cried this week, so much so that I then had to become a donor to WaterAid. By a WaterAid commercial or broadcast that showed that in this world of plenty, where billionaires proliferate, 800 children every single day die from drinking dirty water. Imagine how much sickness and death we could prevent if the world was run on a different basis to that which it is.
I think that's absolutely right. There are if you can believe this figure, there are 1 billion people, George, 1,000 million people in our world today who don't have adequate access to clean drinking water. There are a similar number who go to bed hungry every day. There are a similar number who have inadequate or basically are homeless. And to then think about, for example, we generally talk about the coronavirus pandemic, to think about limiting the effects or bringing the benefits of modern medicine it's farcical, George. So a system which polarizes wealth in so few hands that Jeff Bezos is shortly expected to become a trillionaire, to have $1,000 billion, whereas on the other hand, there are literally half the world's population who live on $2 or less a day. Is a system which is totally unsustainable and gives rise to so many of the problems we have, and equally has a massive impact upon coronavirus. It's terrible to hear that the numbers are increasing in India. I think there's already a gross underestimation of the numbers, because essentially there's an edict that really public testing shouldn't be done, even when patients are turning up to government hospitals with pneumonia. They're not really being adequately tested. So, and despite that, numbers are increasing at an alarming rate, and I think that is going to be a real worry. So
except in Kerala, Doctor.
True, very true. And for the reasons you've mentioned before, where if you actually mobilize the population on a public health basis, even a poor country can respond incredibly well to this public health emergency and others. When resources are shared well, distributed fairly, and human life is put first on the agenda rather than profit-making, the response is much better. And it's much of that underlay the very poor initial response of our own government.
I've got to read you this email. I think you're wonderful. But Tony says, offer Dr. Ranjeet one of your hats. That's a lockdown haircut, if ever I saw one. Thank you.
It's my wife's haircut, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranjeet Brar. My wife nearly took my ear off. She is from the Netherlands. I thought she was doing a Van Gogh. Jared is in Pennsylvania. Go ahead, Jared.
Hello, George, and God bless.
Thank you, sir.
Take that. I'm calling about the recent string of attacks on workers in Pennsylvania, but not the way you're thinking, like physical, actual attacks, assaults on workers, telling people to come into stores wearing masks. There was a cop who just recently came into my store yesterday, and he told me that at a local Wegmans, they were throwing literal beer cans at each other because he didn't want to put his mask on. And also, 2 associates at another Rite Aid pharmacy that I work at were also assaulted. So this is getting completely out of hand with this just. I don't even know what to describe it. These freedom absolutists almost.
Yeah.
People that don't want to wear masks.
I'll tell you what, Jared, be grateful they didn't unleash their automatic weapons, which, of course, many of these freedom warriors are carrying around with them. I've got to press on because of the hour, and I've literally got 25 callers. I'm going to try and get through 15. Jared, thank you. Mike is in the Bahamas. That's irresistible.
Yes, hi.
That's irresistible.
How are you?
My first ever call from the Bahamas. Welcome, Mike.
You're my favorite politician, bar none.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm actually American and UK dual national.
Okay.
Obviously born and raised in America.
Okay.
I want to know, did you see that BBC series, Years and Years?
I didn't actually, no. Forgive me.
Okay, at the beginning of episode 5, there's this populist fascist PM who gets elected, and there's this Scottish radio announcer who criticizing the government and gets carried off by thugs during his radio program, and you have to be the inspiration for that.
That's amazing.
So actually,
it's called Years and Years.
Yes, and I emailed you a little snippet. And if you go 70 seconds into it, there's 70 seconds into the 5th episode. I mean, the guy doesn't look like you, but with the Scottish accent, it has to be you.
Well, I'll listen to it, and if possible, we'll play it next week, Mike.
Yes, I think you should be able to play it. I don't know if there's any legal issues because it's BBC.
There may be copyright issues, yeah. But I'll summarize it anyway. Okay, last word from you, Mike.
Yes, you had that person, I can't remember what her name was.
Rachel Blevins.
Rachel. Yes, I actually disagree with her because it seems like the Democrats have nominated the only person who could lose to Donald Trump.
I think you've got it, mate. That's exactly correct. Mike, I need to press on. Do forgive me, please, because Joshua is in London, and I want to take him next. Joshua, go ahead.
You all right, George? How's it going?
Yes, it's a very busy show tonight. Thank you. Press on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the failed coup in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is broken-backed to an extent. It's in quite a dire situation. How is it that America failed to successfully stage a coup there now, and yet it was so successful in doing so in Chile in 1973 against a government that was maybe not that well entrenched, but certainly in a better position in Chile then than the Venezuelan government is now?
Well, the key difference is that the Chilean army was acting in concert with the United States, and it was the army that carried out the coup. The Venezuelan army is loyal to the state and to the constitution and to the elected president. So that's the key difference. But the overarching difference is that the United States of 1973 is not the United States of 2020. The United States is far, far weaker politically, in terms of its soft power, in terms of its own political stability, but most crucially, its economic strength. The United States had only one rival that was already sinking towards extinction in 1973. Now the United States is being rapidly overtaken by the rivals that are coming out, popping up everywhere. That's the main difference, Joshua.
Yeah, no, I understand. I sometimes think it's a bit of a random, almost arbitrary process where you have a failed Bay of Pigs invasion aimed at toppling Castro, and yet over a decade later you have like a successful coup against Chile, but then you have a sort of a failed coup against Venezuela. And of course there was the successful coup that the CIA staged in Iran against Mossadegh.
Yeah, and do bear in mind, Joshua, that the Venezuela story is not over yet, I'm afraid. David's in Chicago. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, David.
George, it's such an honor talking to you. I've been following you and listening to you since 2003.
Wow, thank you very much.
Yes, your position on the illegal, immoral Iraq war that my country and your country waged and killed hundreds of thousands of people. That's not what I'm calling about. I'm calling about, I have 6 children. One of them is an adult now. The other 5 are still in school. And
well, we've got a lot in common. In 2 months, I'll have 6 children, and one of them's an adult now.
Many congratulations in advance. That's wonderful.
You. God bless you. Thanks.
Children are just a wonderful thing to have.
Absolutely.
On January 21st, when I heard the news about the coronavirus victim in Washington, the first time I heard about it, a few days later, I had to sit there. I was thinking really hard, and I just had a feeling this is going to become a pandemic. So I decided to go ahead and pull my kids out of school. Naturally, the school district waged a war on me for the following, and for weeks, telling me that I was doing the wrong thing. And of course, legally in the state that I live in, I have the right to pull my kids out of school anytime and homeschool them. And I was told by the school superintendent that there's no way that we're going to get it in Illinois. They were convinced that this corona was never going to come to Illinois. And today, you know, on your poll, I answered absolutely not. There was no way I would send my kids back. The only way I would send my kids back if you know there is a vaccine that's safe and has to be certified by the WHO, because I don't trust our government here. And I'm finding that many of my friends don't trust this government. They didn't trust this government when Obama was president. We definitely don't trust it now that we got this buffoon in the White House.
Totally brilliant, brilliant call, David. David, one of the best calls of the night. I love you. Thank you so much. Don't be a stranger. Call back soon. Neil is in London. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Neil.
Thank you, George. I've been a fan of yours since your firebrand articulated assaults on Parliament were years ago. I think your talents are wasted, that you should be actually teaching Parliament how to speak.
Thank you, sir. Very kind of you to say.
So my question here is regarding something that seems to be missing in the dialogue of the governments worldwide with regards to COVID-19, and that is that the method on which someone, you know, survives it is through their immunity. I was wondering, why isn't there anything advised to the population on supporting their immune system and showing people how to improve it so that we get through this pandemic?
That's a very good point. There's nothing holistic about the way in which the government are treating this. Nothing at all. Everything they could have done, they didn't, and everything they did, they shouldn't. It has been a farce. It has been a calamity from start to finish. Now, there's a lot of immunosuppressant life factors that can't be changed in an instant. It is an issue that so many people in Britain are obese. It is an issue that so many people in Britain still smoke and so on, although nicotine appears to be a repellent to COVID-19 at least. But it's certainly not a healthy way to live. And I speak as one who lived unhealthily with smoke for decades. These are things that can't be done overnight. But we never hear anything about the way in which people could strengthen their immune system. Give us a couple of quick suggestions.
Well, my way that I do it is I take an organic vitamin C daily, and I take selenium, zinc, and magnesium, and it goes with vitamin D3, and those basics are the ones that you start with going along to the road to health. But the problem I'm asking is, why isn't there not a word about it worldwide?
I can't speak for worldwide. I certainly agree with you that it isn't spoken about nearly enough here. Neil, thanks for the call. Wayne is in Cheshire. Go ahead, Wayne.
Hello. I've been listening to the show this evening, and a couple of things come to mind. The first one is about the Eton, Harrow, and the
private schools, yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot of them are on the Highlands of Scotland. Anyway, the question I want to know, I'd love to know, is how have they come to that conclusion about opening in September? Was it pressure off the parents, or do they know something we don't know.
I would think it's common sense. They're applying common sense, and the government is not applying common sense when it comes to state school children.
Right, now, this is connected information. I don't even know this, but a number of the government scientists which advise the government have resigned, and they've gone off on their own with their own group, because the chairman of their new group said they've been giving information to the government but not doing as what they should have done to do with the public. But it's very hard to get information of what they're actually saying now, because they want to give us the truth of their scientific research.
Thank you, Wayne in Cheshire. Clear the lines. There's a legend on the floor. Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
Hi.
I heard this very intelligent young man last night posing this question. He said that the rich list that's published, because that's topical at the moment, every year may be of interest, but he's heard that Tony Benn once said, wouldn't it be a better idea to publish annually the number of people suffering from poverty, bad housing,
a poor list?
Things?
A poor list.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then...
That'd be a long list, though, Norma.
Yeah, but then help to try and rectify this situation by updating that every year, you know?
It's a very good, very, very good suggestion. I didn't know that Mr. Ben had suggested that. It's a very good idea.
And the other quick thing is, if there's now a vacancy on the Hall of Fame, may I suggest they stick you in and get Bernie off?
Thank you. Very kind of you, dear Norma. Stay safe. By the way, I've just been reminded, you may say I shouldn't have had to be reminded, that my appearance at the US Senate was 15 years ago this very day. And I suspect I've been reminded of it by Ron Mackay, our editor, who was the distinguished-looking gentleman sat next to me, the one with the silver hair, who looked like he could have been a senator himself. It was my finest hour. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It brought me to widespread American attention and to worldwide attention, because every camera from every country in the world was there in the Senate room. And I made the point at the time, forgive me if you've heard me say it before, but when I was young, I was a boxer. And so I was aware that there is a moment in a fight when you can see in your opponent's eyes that they no longer want to be there. And I saw that light in the eyes of the senators that were seeking to persecute me. I saw the light die in their eyes, the light of wishing to carry on with the proceedings. But unfortunately for them, the entire world's media had been assembled. And I could almost hear them thinking, whose idea was this? As George W. Bush might have put it, they misunderestimated me. Who is this council house, torag, uneducated tague that has turned up here in front of we princes of the US Senate and is knocking hell out of us on primetime television? Who is this man? Thought he had never been to university. No Harvard, no Yale, no Oxford, no Cambridge, no nothing. Educated at Michelin Tires in Dundee, sadly soon to close. It was a remarkable occasion, one which was almost dreamlike in its quality. But I knew that I had done well when I came out of the Senate committee room and a black janitor, it's the first time it ever happened to me, a black janitor high-fived me in the corridor and said, "Way to go, man. You just sent George Bush back to his ranch." Now, I had never heard the phrase, "way to go," and I had never been high-fived. And I thought, blimey, that must have gone well. And so, indeed, it did. It was a seminal moment, of course, in my life. It established the fact that is or should be well known, that the highest act that one can perform is to tell the truth at the court of the Sultan. That's what I was determined to do, and by the grace of God, who gave me wings that day, I was able to do it. Now, as I said earlier, I'm speaking on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. on my Facebook, my YouTube, my Twitter, on the subject of Israel-Palestine, laying out the history, but also laying out what I hope will be the future. If you're at all interested in that subject, and it's been my experience that many millions of you are, I hope you'll tune in Tuesday night at 8 p.m. I hope you get my book, which I'll have to stop signing and dedicating soon. I said I'd sign and dedicate the first 1,000. I've already done far more than that, but there it is there on the screen. If you want it dedicated and signed, then send now a message to info@georgegalloway.com, or you can get it straight off Amazon, but it won't be signed and it won't be dedicated. So please, because I'm nearly finished its sequel, but I can't publish the sequel until I've sold a decent number of the original. The sequel's called Black Lake, by the way, and those in the West Bromwich area will know why. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. My apologies if I didn't get to your call, or your call was briefer than you would have liked. And my apologies if I didn't get to your social media message. My message is, please come back next week at the same time, in the same place, and bring another viewer, another listener with you. May God go with all of you. Stay safe. It's been marvellous.